branch of the London, Scottish and Midland Bank. The branch which Mr. Green controlled lay at the corner of Pell Street and Furling Avenue. It was a fairly large building, for the bank had some very substantial customers. On Wednesday afternoons, in preparation for the paydays of these organisations, large sums in currency were brought from head office and deposited in the steel and concrete strongroom. Lying immediately beneath Mr. Green's private office, the strongroom could be entered through a steel door in the general office. This door could be seen from the street, and, to assist observation, a lamp fixed to the wall immediately above threw a powerful beam on the door. A night watchman named Arthur Malling, an army pensioner, was employed to enhance the security even further. The bank lay on a police beat, so arranged that the constable on patrol passed every 40 minutes. His orders were to look through the window, wait until Malling appeared, and exchange signals with him. On the night of October the 17th, Police Constable Burnett stopped as usual and glanced into the bank. The first thing he noticed was that the light above the strongroom door wasn't on. His suspicions aroused, the officer didn't wait for the night watchman to put in an appearance, but went to the front door. To his alarm, he found it ajar. Calling Malling by name, he entered the bank. Permeating the air was a faint, sweet scent which he couldn't locate. When he entered the manager's room, he found the light on, and lying on the ground he saw the night watchman. His wrists were handcuffed, and 2 straps had been tightly buckled about his knees and ankles. The strange, sickly aroma was now explained. From the perforated bottom of an old tin can, suspended from the picture rail, some liquid was trickling onto a thick cotton pad which covered Malling's face. Burnett recognized the smell of chloroform. He dragged the unconscious man into the outer office. Here he snatched the pad from his face and telephoned the police station. Police reserves arrived within a few minutes, and with them the divisional surgeon who, fortunately, had been at the station when the alarm came through. Every effort to restore the unfortunate man to life proved unavailing. "He was probably dead when he was found," was the police doctor's verdict. "What those scratches are on his right palm is a mystery." He pulled open the clenched fist and showed 6 little scratches. They were recent, for there was a smear of blood on the palm. Burnett was sent at once to arouse Mr. Green, the manager, who lived in Furling Avenue, not far from the bank. He'd hardly knocked before the door was open, and Mr. Lambton Green appeared, fully dressed and in a state of considerable agitation. Constable Burnett saw a big case and an overcoat on a hall chair. The manager listened, pale as death, whilst Burnett told him of his discovery. "The bank robbed? Oh, my God, this is awful!" He was so near collapsing that Burnett had to assist him into the street. "I was going away on a holiday," he said as he walked up the dark thoroughfare towards the bank. "The fact is, I was resigning from the bank. I left a note, explaining to the directors." Into a circle of suspicious men the manager tottered. He unlocked the drawer of his desk and crumpled up. "They're not here. I left them here. My keys, with the note." And then he fainted. When the dazed man recovered, he found himself in a police cell. Later in the day, he drooped before a police magistrate and listened, as in a dream, to a charge of causing the death of Arthur Malling and, further, of converting to his own use the sum of £100,000. It was on the morning of Mr. Lambton Green's remand into custody that Mr. John G. Reader, with some reluctance, for he was suspicious of all government departments, transferred himself from his own office in Lower Regent Street to a somewhat gloomy bureau on the top floor of the building which housed the public prosecutor. In making this change, he stipulated only that he should be connected by private telephone with his old bureau. He didn't demand this. He never demanded anything. He asked, nervously and apologetically. There was a certain wistful helplessness about John G. Reader that made people feel sorry for him, that caused even the public prosecutor a few uneasy moments of doubt as to whether he had been quite wise in substituting this weak-appearing middle-aged man for Inspector Halford, bluff, capable, and heavily mysterious. Mr. Reader was something over 50, a long-faced gentleman with sandy grey hair and a slither of side whiskers that mercifully distracted attention from his large, outstanding ears. He invariably wore glasses which slithered down his nose. His black jacket and striped trousers failed to give an air of dependability, and his bowler did nothing to improve the situation. Mr. Reader's neatest appendage was an umbrella rolled so tight that it might be mistaken for a walking stick. Rain or shine, he carried this article hooked to his arm, and within living memory it had never been unfurled. Inspector Halford met him in the office to hand over his duties. "Glad to know you, Mr. Reader. I've heard a lot about you. You've been doing Bank of England work, haven't you?" Mr. Reader whispered that he'd had that honour. Mr. Halford's scrutiny was full of misgivings. "Well, this job's different. I'm told you're one of the best-informed men in London, but even so, we've never had an outsider, so to speak, a private detective in this office before, and, well, naturally, the Yard's a bit—" "I quite understand," murmured Mr. Reader. "Very natural. Mr. Bolland expected the appointment. His wife is annoyed, very properly. She's an ambitious woman. She owns a third of a West End club that might be raided one of these days." Halford was staggered. This information was little more than a whispered rumour at Scotland Yard. "How the devil do you know that?" Mr. Reader smiled apologetically. "One picks up scraps of information. I see wrong in everything. That's the odd thing about me. I have a criminal mind." Halford drew a long breath. "Well, there's nothing much doing. That Ealing case is pretty clear. We soon discovered that Green's an ex-convict. How he managed to keep it dark, I don't know. He's done 7 years for conversion." "Embezzlement and conversion," murmured Mr. Reader. I'm afraid I was the principal witness against him at the time. Bank crimes were rather a hobby of mine. Yes, he got into difficulties with money-lenders. Very foolish. Poor fellow. With his life at stake, you might forgive his pitiful prevarications." The inspector stared at the new man. "There's not much poor fellow about Green. He's stowed £100,000 away somewhere. As to that yarn he tells—" Mr. J.G. Reader nodded sadly. "Not an ingenious story. If I remember rightly, it went something like this. He'd been recognised by a man who served in Dartmoor with him, and this fellow sent a blackmailing letter. Sooner than return to a life of crime, Green wrote out all the facts for his directors, put the letter in the drawer of his desk with his keys, and left a note for his head cashier on the desk itself, intending to leave London and make a fresh start where he was unknown." "There were no letters in or on the desk," said the inspector, "and no keys. The only true part of the yarn was that he had done time." Left alone in his office, Mr. Reader spent a considerable time on his private telephone, communing with the person in his old office. For the rest of the morning he read the depositions about the Ealing case. It was late in the afternoon when the public prosecutor strolled into his room and glanced at the pile of manuscript through which his subordinate was wading. "Reading the Green business? Seems fairly straightforward." Mr. Reader looked up with the pained expression he invariably wore when he was puzzled. "The evidence of Policeman Burnett," he said. "Perhaps you can enlighten me, sir. He said, let me read it. Some time before I reached the bank premises, I saw a man standing at the corner immediately outside the bank. Immediately after I saw him, My foot struck a piece of iron. I shone my torch on the object and found it was an old horseshoe. I had seen children playing with this earlier in the evening. When I looked again towards the corner, the man had disappeared. I saw no other person, and, so far as I can remember, there was no light showing in Green's house when I passed it." Mr. Reader looked up. "Well," said the prosecutor, "the man was probably Green. He must have dodged round the block." Mr. Reader scratched his chin. "Perhaps. Would it be considered indecorous if I made a few inquiries independent of the police? I shouldn't like them to think that a mere amateur was interfering." "By all means," said the prosecutor. "Go and see the officer in charge. I'll give you a note to him. It is by no means unusual for my officer to conduct a separate investigation, though I'm afraid you'll discover very little. The ground has been well covered by Scotland Yard." "And would it be permissible to see the man?" "Green? Of course. I'll send up the necessary order." The light was fading when Mr. Reader, furled umbrella hooked to his arm, stepped through the dark gateway of Brixton Prison. He was led to a cell where a man sat, his head on his hands. Reader, with his extraordinary memory for faces, recognised Lambton Green the moment he saw him, though it was some time before the recognition was mutual. "Oh, Mr. Reader, I remember you now. You were the gentleman who caught me before. But I've been straight as a die, never taken a farthing that didn't belong to me. Every word I told the police was true. What my poor girl will think—" "Are you married?" asked Mr. Reader. "No, but I was going to be, rather late in life. She's nearly 30 years younger than me, and the best girl that ever—" Reader listened to the rhapsody that followed, the melancholy deepening in his face. "She hasn't been into the court, thank God, but she knows the truth. It happened on her birthday, too." "Did she know you were going away?" "Yes, I told her the night before. But I'm not going to bring her into the case. If we'd been properly engaged, it would be different, but she's married. She's divorcing her husband, but the decree hasn't been made absolute yet. We had to keep quiet about our engagement, or it could have stopped the divorce going through. It was pretty galling for me, having to keep quiet about it. All sorts of men were making up to her. Even that fool Burnett, who arrested me, he had fallen for her. Used to write her poetry. Wouldn't think it possible in a policeman, would you?" The outrageous incongruity of a poetical policeman didn't seem to shock Mr. Reader. "There's poetry in every soul, Mr. Green, and a policeman is a man." Nevertheless, the poetical policeman filled his mind all the way to his house in the Brockley Road, and occupied his thoughts for the rest of his waking time. To Furling Avenue, and pursued his way down the broad street. On either side ran a row of pretty villas, pretty, although they bore a strong family resemblance to one another. Green's was the 18th on the right-hand side. Here he'd lived with a cook housekeeper. He was no gardener, for the forecourt was covered with grass, growing at will. Before the house numbered 412, Mr. Reader paused and gazed with mild interest at the blue blinds which covered every window. Evidently Miss Magda Grain was a lover of flowers, for geraniums filled the window boxes. In the centre of the grass plot was a circular flower bed, with one flowerless rose tree, the leaves of which were drooping and brown. As he raised his eyes to the upper window, he was conscious that there was a figure behind the white net curtains. Mr. Reader walked hurriedly away, as one caught in an immodest act. Eventually he came to the big nursery gardeners on the corner at the far end of the road. Here he stood for some time in contemplation, his arm resting on the iron railings, his eyes staring blankly at the vista of greenhouses. After some while he turned and slowly retraced his steps. At number 412 he stopped again, opened the little gate, and passed up the path to the front door. A small girl answered his knock and ushered him into the sitting-room. The room was scarcely furnished. All it contained was some wicker chairs, a square of carpet, and a bamboo table. Above his head he heard the sound of feet on bare boards, and then presently the door opened and a girl came in. She was pretty, but her face was pale and haggard, and she looked as though she'd recently been weeping. Mr. Reader rose. "Miss Magda Grain?" She nodded. "Are you from the police?" "Not exactly," he said. "I hold an appointment in the office of the public prosecutor." She frowned. "I wondered if anybody would come to see me. Mr. Green sent you?" "Mr. Green told me of your existence. He didn't send me." In that second there came to her face a look which almost startled him. Fleetingly an expression had dawned and passed, almost before the untrained eye could detect its passage. "What made him do it?" she said. "You think he's guilty?" "The police think so. I wish to God I'd never seen this place." He didn't answer. His eyes were roving round the room. On the bamboo table was a glass vase which had been clumsily filled with golden chrysanthemums of a peculiarly beautiful variety. Amidst them one large Michaelmas daisy looked forlornly out of place. "You're fond of flowers?" he murmured. She looked at the vase indifferently. "Yes, I like flowers." She paused. "Do you think they'll hang him?" "It is a very serious charge," said Mr. Reader. He looked around. "Have you a photograph of Mr. Green?" "Yes. Do you want it?" He nodded. She'd hardly left the room before he was at the bamboo table, had lifted out the flowers, and was examining the ends. What he'd thought was correct. None of these flowers had been cut. They'd been plucked bodily from their stalks and tied roughly with string. Beneath the string was the paper which had been first wrapped about them, a page torn from a notebook. He could see the faint lines, but the pencilled writing was indecipherable. As her feet sounded on the stairs, he replaced the flowers in the vase, and when she came in, he was looking through the window into the street. "Thank you," he said as he took the photograph from her. It bore an affectionate inscription on the back. "You're married, he tells me." "Yes, practically divorced." "Have you been living here long?" "About 3 months. He wanted me to live here." He looked at the photograph again. "Do you know Constable Burnett?" A dull flush came to her face and died away. "A silly fool," she said, and then, realizing that she had been surprised into a not altogether ladylike expression, went on, "Mr. Burnett is rather sentimental. I don't like sentimental people, Mr. Reader," murmured that gentleman. "You understand, Mr. Reader, that when a girl is engaged, and in my position, those kind of attentions are not very welcome." Reader looked at her keenly. Of her sorrow and distress there could be no doubt. "On your birthday," he said. "How very sad. You were born on the 17th of October. How old are you?" 23. Mr. Reader took off his glasses and polished them on a large silk handkerchief. "The whole thing is inexpressibly sad," he said. "I'm glad to have had the opportunity of speaking with you. I sympathize with you very deeply." And in this unsatisfactory way he took his departure. She closed the door on him, saw him stop in the middle of the path and pick up something from a border bed, and wondered, frowning, why this middle-aged man had picked up the horseshoe she had thrown out of the window the night before. Into Mr. Reader's pocket it went, and then he continued his thoughtful way to the nursery gardens, for he had a few questions to ask. The men of Section 10 were parading for duty when Mr. Reader came timidly into the charge room and produced his credentials to the inspector in charge. "Oh, yes, Mr. Reader. We've had a note from the PP's office. Now, what can I do for you?" "Burnett? Yes, he's here." He called the man's name, and a young and good-looking officer stepped from the ranks. "Burnett, this gentleman's from the public prosecutor's office, and he wants a little talk with you." "You'd better use my office, Mr. Reader." The young policeman followed him into the privacy of the inspector's office. He was a confident young man. Already his name and picture had appeared in the newspapers, and there was more than a hint of promotion. "They tell me you're something of a poet," said Mr. Reader. Burnett blushed. "Why, yes, sir. I write a bit." "Love poems?" asked Mr. Reader. "One finds time in the night for such fancies, and there's no inspiration like love, officer?" Burnett's face was crimson. "I've done a bit of writing in the night, sir, though I've never neglected my duty." "Oh, naturally," murmured Mr. Reader. "You have a poetical mind. It was a poetical thought to pluck flowers in the middle of the night." "The nurseryman told me I could take any flowers I wanted," said Burnett. I did nothing wrong." Reader inclined his head in agreement. "I know. You picked the flowers in the dark. By the way, you inadvertently included a Michaelmas daisy with your chrysanthemums, tied your little poem to them, and left them on the doorstep with a horseshoe. I wondered what had become of that horseshoe." The uncomfortable young man corrected him. "I threw them up onto the lady's windowsill. As a matter of fact, the idea didn't occur to me until after I'd passed the house." "Oh, this," said Mr. Reader, "is what I want to confirm. The idea of leaving the flowers didn't occur to you until you had passed her house? The horseshoe suggested the thought? Then you went back, picked the flowers, tied them up with a little poem you'd already written, and tossed them up to her window." Constable Burnett's face was a study. "I don't know how you guessed that." "If I've done anything wrong—" "It's never wrong to be in love," said Mr. J.G. Reader. "Love is a very beautiful experience. I've frequently read about it." Miss Magda Grain had dressed to go out for the afternoon when she saw the man who had called that morning walking up the tessellated path. Behind him she recognized a detective engaged in the case. She pulled up the overlay of her bed, took out a flat pad of banknotes and thrust them into her handbag. Then she went out to the landing, into the unfurnished back room, and, opening the window, dropped to the flat roof of the kitchen. In another minute she was in the garden and through the back gate. A narrow passage divided the two lines of villas that backed on one another. She was in the high street and had boarded a bus before Mr. Reader grew tired of knocking. To the best of his knowledge, Mr. Reader never saw her again. At the public prosecutor's request, he called at his chief's house after dinner and told his surprising story. Green was undoubtedly an ex-convict, and he spoke the truth when he said that he'd received a letter from a man who'd served a period of imprisonment with him. The name of this blackmailer is, or rather was, Arthur George Crater, whose other name was Malling. "Not the night watchman?" said the public prosecutor. Mr. Reader nodded. "Yes, sir. And Malling's daughter is Miss Magda Crater. Malling had planned this bank robbery very carefully. He'd brought his daughter to Ealing under a false name and had managed to get her introduced to Mr. Green. Magda's job was to worm her way into Green's confidence and learn all she could. Possibly it was part of her duty to secure casts of the keys. Now, whether Malling recognized Green as an old prison acquaintance or whether he obtained the facts from the girl isn't important. But as soon as he did know, he saw an opportunity of throwing suspicion for the robbery on the manager. The story about Magda waiting for a divorce, that was to make sure that Green kept their association a secret. Then came the night of the 17th, the time chosen for the robbery. Malling's plan to get rid of the manager had succeeded. He saw the letter on the table in Green's private office and read it. He took the keys, though in all probability he had a duplicate set, and cleared as much money from the bank vaults as he could carry, and hurried it round to the house in Furling Avenue. There it was buried in the central bed of the front garden, under a rose bush. I rather imagine there was something interfering with the nutrition of that unfortunate bush the first time I saw it. In replanting the rose bush, as he did in some haste, Malling scratched his hand on its thorns. He then hurried back to the bank and waited, knowing that Constable Burnett was due. He had prepared the can of chloroform, the handcuffs, and the straps. He waited at the corner until he saw the flash of Burnett's torch. Then, running into the bank and leaving the door ajar, he strapped himself, fastened the handcuffs, and lay down, expecting that the policeman would arrive, find the open door, and rescue him before much harm was done. But Constable Burnett had had some pleasant exchanges with Magda. Doubtless her father had told her to be as pleasant to him as possible. Burnett was a poetical young man, knew it was her birthday, and as he walked along his foot struck an old horseshoe. The idea occurred to him that he might attach the horseshoe to some flowers, which the nurseryman had given him permission to pick, and leave his little bouquet, so to speak, at his lady's feet. A poetical idea, and one worthy of the finest traditions of the Metropolitan Police Force. This he did, but it took some time, and all the while this young man was philandering, Arthur Crater was dying. When the policeman eventually reached the bank 10 minutes after he was due, the man was dead. The public prosecutor sat back and frowned at his new subordinate. "How on earth did you piece all that together?" Mr. Reader shook his head sadly. "It's my peculiarity, a terrible misfortune. I see evil in everything, in dying rose bushes, in horseshoes, even in poetry. I have the mind of a criminal. It's deplorable." A gentleman who liked to work in an office where the ticking of a clock was audible and the turning of a paper produced a gentle disturbance. One morning, the catalogue of Messrs. Willoughby, the eminent estate agents, was delivered to his office by messenger, and he turned the pages with a thoughtful expression. Presently he smoothed down a leaf and read again the flattering description of a fairly unimportant property. Riverside Bower, 2 reception, 2 bedrooms, large dry cellars, lawn to river, small skiff and punt. The word "let" had recently been scrawled on the margin in red ink. "Aha," said Mr. Reader, for in November, a month chiefly distinguished by mists, rain, and general discomfort, riverside cottages are normally somewhat of a drag on the market. He pulled his telephone towards him. "Let, is it? Dear me. To an American gentleman? When will it be available?" The new tenant had taken the house for a month. Mr. Reader was even more intrigued, though his interest in the so-called American gentleman wasn't quite as intensive as that gentleman's interest in Mr. Reader. When the great Art Lomer came on a business trip from Canada to London, a friend and admirer carried him off one day to see the capital's principal attraction. "He generally comes out at lunchtime," said the friend, who was called Cheap because his name was Sparrow. "And there he is!" A middle-aged man had emerged from a large grey building. On his head was a black hat. His body was encased in an ill-fitting black coat and striped trousers. A weakish man with yellowy-white side-whiskers. "Him?" said the amazed Art. "Is that the kind of guy you're scared about? You're crazy. Why, that man couldn't catch a cold. Now back home in Toronto—" Art operated from Toronto, which, through its proximity to the United States border, gave him certain advantages. He had once operated in Canada itself, but, his line at that period being robbery accompanied by assault, he'd found himself facing a Canadian magistrate and had been sent down for 5 years. Thereafter he cut out violence and confined himself to the formation of his troupe. And Art Loma's troupe was famous from the Atlantic to the Pacific. "So, that's your reader?" said Art Loma. "Well, if Canada and the USA was full of goats like him, I'd pull in more dollars in 1 month than Hollywood pays in 10 years. Listen, does that guy pack a timepiece? Does he wear a watch, do you mean? Sure, a pocket one. I'll bring it to you in 5 minutes. I'm going to show you something." It was the maddest thing Art Loma had ever done. He was in London on business, and was jeopardizing $1 million for the sake of the cheap applause of a man whose opinion he didn't care a cent about. Mr. Reader was standing on the pavement, waiting for a gap in the traffic, when a strange man bumped against him. "Excuse me, sir." "Not at all," murmured Mr. Reader. "I'm afraid my watch is 5 minutes fast. You can see the correct time by Big Ben." Mr. Loma felt a hand dip into his coat pocket and, like one hypnotized, saw the watch go back into J.G. Reader's. "Over here for long?" asked Mr. Reader. "Why, yes." "It's a nice time of the year, but the country isn't quite as beautiful as Canada in the fall. How is Leone?" Art Loma swayed slightly and blinked hard as if he were trying to wake up. Leone was the proprietor of a little restaurant in Buffalo, which was the advanced base of those operations so profitable to Art and his friends. "Leone? Say, Mr. And the troupe? Are they performing in England, or, resting? I think that's the word." Art gaped at him. On Mr. Reader's face was an expression of solicitude and inquiry, as though the well-being of the troupe was an absorbing preoccupation of his. "Say, listen," began Art. But before he could collect his thoughts, Reader was crossing the road with nervous glances left and right, his umbrella gripped tight. Mr. Loma walked back very slowly to where he'd left his anxious companion. "No, he got away before I could touch him," he said briefly, for he had his pride. "Come along, we'll get some eats. It's nearly—" He looked at his wrist, but his watch was gone. Mr. Reader could be heavily jocular on occasions. "Art Loma," said the Director of Public Prosecutions, whose servant Mr. J.G. Reader was. "Is there anything against him?" "No, though I have come into possession of a watch of his which I find, by reference to my private file, was stolen in Cleveland 5 years ago. It's in the police records of the time. Only, it seems remarkable that this gentleman should be in London at the end of the tourist season." The director pursed his lips dubiously. "Well, tell the Yard. He doesn't belong to us. What's his speciality?" "He's a troop leader. I think that's the term. Mr. Loma was once associated with a theatrical company, in a humble capacity." "You mean he's an actor?" "A producer, sir, rather than an actor. I've heard about his troupe, though I've never had the pleasure of seeing them perform. A talented company." "I don't quite follow you," said the director. "How did this watch come into your possession, Reader?" "A little jest on my part. A little jest." The director knew Mr. Reader too well to pursue the subject. Loma was living at the Hotel Calvert in Bloomsbury. He occupied an important suite, for, being in the position of a man who was after big fish, he couldn't cavil at the cost of the bait. The big fish had bitten much sooner than he'd dared to hope. Its name was Bertie Claude Staffen, and there was indeed something very fish-like about this young man with his dull eyes and permanently opened mouth. Bertie's father had been rich beyond the dreams of actresses. He'd been a pottery manufacturer who'd bought cotton mills as a sideline, and he'd made so much money that he never hired a taxi if he could take a bus, and never took a bus if he could walk. Bertie Claude had inherited all his father's meanness and almost every penny of his money. Bertie Claude had one quality which few would suspect in him, the gift of romantic dreaming. When he wasn't occupied in cutting down overheads or speeding up production, he loved to picture himself in heroic situations, stumbling on hidden treasure or winning fabulous amounts of money at the Monte Carlo casino. Most of his dreams were about money, in sufficient quantities to repay him for the death duties on his father's estate. When Bertie Claude was shown into Art's private sitting room at the Calford Hotel, he stepped into a world of heady romance. For the table in the centre of the room was covered with specimens of quartz recovered from a brand-new mine located by Art's mythical brother, and sited at a spot known only to two men, one of whom was Art Lomer, and the other Bertie Claude Staffen. Mr. Staffen inspected the ore with interest. "I've had the assay," he said. "The Johnny who did it is a friend of mine and didn't charge a penny. His report's promising." "The company," began Art, but Mr. Staffen raised a warning finger. "I think you know that I don't intend speculating $1 in this mine. I'm putting up no money. What I'm prepared to do is to use my influence in the promotion for a quid pro quo. You know what that means?" "Something for nothing," said Art, and in this instance wasn't entirely wide of the mark. "But my friends put up the money, Mr. Staffen. I wouldn't come over here trying to get money from a gentleman who's practically a stranger. I know we met in Canada, but what do you know about me? I might be a crook, a con man, anything." Some such idea had occurred to Bertie Claude, but the very frankness of his friend dispelled something of his suspicions. "You say you have the money for the company?" "Every cent. I'm not in a position to offer a single share. Not that you need worry about that. I've reserved a few from promotion. No, sir, I never had any intention of allowing you to pay a cent." He knocked off the ash of his cigar and frowned. "You've been mighty nice to me, Mr. Staffen, and though I don't feel called upon to tell every man my business, I feel sort of confident about you. This mine means nothing." Bertie Claude's eyebrows rose. "I don't quite get you." Art's smile was slow and a little sad. "Doesn't it occur to you that if I've got the capital for that property, it was foolish of me to take a trip to Europe?" Bertie had certainly wondered. Selling that mine was like selling bars of gold. It didn't want any doing. "No, sir, I'm here on business that would make your hair stand up, if you know." He rose abruptly and paced the room with quick, nervous strides, his brow furrowed in thought. Suddenly he stopped. "What you doing Wednesday?" The brusqueness of the question took Bertie Claude aback. "Wednesday? Well, I don't know that I'm doing anything." Mr. Lomer bit his lip thoughtfully. "I got a little house on the river. Come down and spend a night with me, and I'll let you into a secret that the newspapers would give $1 million to know. If you read it in a book, you wouldn't believe it. Say, I'll tell you now." And with some hesitation, Mr. Lomer told his story. "Politics and all that I know nothing about, but I do know that some of the royalty that have been kicked off their thrones recently have been feeling the pinch. About 6 months ago, a couple came out of the USA in a hurry with a sheriff's posse behind them, and I happened to be staying on a farm near the border when they turned up." "And what do you think they'd been doing?" Mr. Staffen shook his head. "Peddling emeralds. Yes, sir. One had a paper bag full of 'em, all sizes. I bought the lot for $12,000, took 'em down to Toronto, and got 'em valued at something under $1 million. Bertie Claude listened, open-mouthed. "And these fellas had been peddling jewelry for 4 years. Some broken-down prince was acting as agent for the others. I didn't ask too many questions." He leant forward and tapped Bertie's knee. "The stuff I bought wasn't a 20th of their stock.
I sent them back for the rest of the loot, and they're due here next week."
$20 million? Gasped Bertie Claude. What will it cost you?
$1 million? Just over £300,000. Come down to my place at Marlow, and I'll show you the best emeralds you ever saw. All that I got left, as a matter of fact. I sold most of them to a Pittsburgh millionaire for... Well, I won't give you the price because you think I robbed him. If you like one stone you see, I'll let you buy it, though I don't want to sell. Well, naturally, I couldn't make profit out of a friend.
When Mr. Stafford left his friend's room, his head was in a whirl, though he experienced a bewildered sense of familiarity with a situation which had often figured in his dreams. As he strode through the hall, a middle-aged man with a high bowler hat stood in his way. "Excuse me, sir. You're Mr. Stafford, aren't you? Could I have a few moments' conversation with you on a matter of some importance?"
Bertie waved an impatient hand. "No time. If you want an appointment, write for one." And he walked out, leaving the sad-looking man to gaze pensively after him. Bertie Claude, who associated the river with sunshine and flannelled ease, shivered as he came out of Marlow railway station with his friend, Mr. Art Lomer. It was raining steadily, and the taxi which was waiting for them at the station dripped from every surface. "Pretty beastly month to take a bungalow on the river," he grumbled. A quarter of an hour's drive, however, brought them to a pretty little cottage which stood in a generous garden. A bright fire burnt in the hall, and there was a general air of comfort about the place that revived Bertie's flagging spirits. A few seconds later they were sitting in a half-timbered dining-room where tea had been laid. Bertie found himself impressed by the comfort of the place and the unexpected service, for there was a pretty maid, a sedate, middle-aged butler, and a sober-faced young man who'd helped him off with his wet raincoat. "No, the house isn't mine," said Mr. Lomer. "It's one I always hire when I'm in England. Jenkins, the butler, is my man, so is the valet. The maid comes from London." After tea he showed Bertie up to his bedroom, and, opening a drawer of his bureau, took out a small steel box fastened with 2 locks. These he unfastened and lifted out a shallow metal tray covered with a layer of cotton wool. "You can have any of these that take your eye," he said. "Make me an offer, and I'll tell you what they're worth." He rolled back the cotton wool and revealed 6 magnificent stones. He took the largest between his finger and thumb. "That one? Oh, that's worth $6,000, about £2,000. And if you offered me that sum for it, I'd think you were a fool, because the only safe way of getting emeralds is to buy 'em 50% under value. I reckon that cost me about—" he made a mental calculation— £90. Bertie's eyes shone. On emeralds he was something of an expert, and that these stones were genuine he knew. "You wouldn't like to sell it for £90? He said. Art Lomer shook his head. "No, sir. I gotta make some profit, even from my friends. I'll let you have it for 100. Bertie's hand sought his inside pocket. "No, I don't want paying now. What do you know about emeralds, anyway? Take it up to town, show it to an expert. I'll give you the check now." Art wrapped up the stone carefully, put it in a small box, and handed it to his companion. Bertie went immediately to the small secretaire, wrote the cheque, tore it out, and handed it to Mr. Lomer. Art looked at it and frowned. "What do I do with this? I got no bank account here." "I'll make it pay bearer," said Bertie. Mr. Lomer was still dubious. "Well, just write a note telling the president or whoever he is to cash that bit of paper. I hate banks anyway." The obliging Bertie Claude scribbled the necessary note. When this was done, Bertie came to business, for he was a businessman. "Can I come in on this jewel deal?" Art Lomer shook his head reluctantly. "Sorry, Mr. Staffen, I've taken all the risk, I've organized the operation, and it's cost money. I just hate to refuse because I like you, Mr. Staffen."
Bertie thought for a moment. "What has the deal cost you up to now?" Again Mr. Lomer shook his head.
"It doesn't matter. If you offered me 4 times the money I've spent, I couldn't let you in on this deal. I might go so far as giving you a small interest, but I wouldn't take money for that."
"We'll talk about it later," said the river with pale gold. Bertie was walking in the garden with his host, when from somewhere above them came the faint hum of a small plane. Presently he saw the machine circling and disappearing behind the nearby quarry wood. He heard an exclamation from the man at his side. "What's the matter?"
"I'm wondering," said Art. "They told me next week, but no, I'm being foolish."
It was dark by the time they went back indoors. The butler had turned on the lights and drawn the blinds, and it wasn't difficult for Bertie to realize that something was disturbing his host. Mr. Lomer sat in front of the fire, gazing into the leaping flames and starting at every sound. After a simple dinner, the 2 men strolled into the drawing-room. "What's the trouble, Lomer?" Art Lomer was about to reply when they heard the doorbell, followed by the sound of voices in the hall. The butler came in.
"There's 2 men and a lady to see you, sir."
Art Lomer bit his lip.
"Show them in."
A second later, a tall man walked into the room, swinging in his hand a pilot's headset.
"Marsham!" cried Mr. Lomer. "What in hell—"
The girl, who followed instantly, claimed Bertie Claude's attention. She was slim and dark, and, despite her pale cheeks and the tired look in her eyes, very beautiful. The second of the men visitors, a squat, foreign-looking individual with a short-clipped beard, was wrapped to his neck in an old overcoat, and his wild-looking head was bare. Art closed the door.
"There's been trouble," said the tall man. "The prince has had another offer. He sent some of the stuff, but he won't part with the pearls or the diamonds until you pay him half of the money you promised. Oh, this is Princess Pauline, the prince's daughter."
Art shot an angry look at the girl.
"See here, young lady, this isn't the way we do business in our country. Your father promised—"
"My father has been very hasty," she said. "He has taken much risk, and I am not sure he has been very honest in the matter. It is very simple for you to pay. If he has your money tonight—"
"Tonight?" boomed Art. "How can I get the money for him tonight?"
"He is in Holland," said the girl. "We have the airplane waiting."
"But how can I get the money tonight? Do you think I carry 100,000 pounds in my pocket?"
She turned to the unkempt little man and said something in a language which was unintelligible to Mr. Staffen. He replied, and she nodded. "Pieter says my father will take your cheque. He only wishes to be sure that there is no—" She paused, at a loss for an English word.
"Did I ever double-cross your father?" said Art. "I can't give you either the money or the cheque. You can call off the deal. I'm through."
By this time the pilot had unrolled the package he carried under his other arm and placed it on the table. Bertie Claude grew breathless at the sight of the glittering display that met his eyes. There were diamonds, set and unset, and ancient pieces of jewellery that must have formed the heirlooms of old families. He beckoned Art aside.
"If you can keep these people here tonight, I'll raise all the money you want on that connection alone."
Art shook his head.
"It's no use, Mr. Staffen. I know this guy. Unless I can send him the money tonight, we'll not smell the rest of the stuff."
A sudden thought struck him.
"Come into the dining room."
Art almost ran ahead of him, and when they reached the room, he closed the door. "You've got your checkbook, but a cheque can't be redeemed for 2 or 3 days. By that time, we could get this stuff up to town to your bankers, and you could keep it until I redeem it.
And what's more, you can stop payment of the cheque tomorrow morning if the stones aren't worth the money."
Bertie looked at the matter from 10 different angles in as many seconds. "Suppose I gave them a post-dated cheque to make sure," he said. "Why, sure, that's a double protection. You make it payable the day after tomorrow." Bertie hesitated no more. He took out his cheque-book and a fountain pen. "Make it pay bearer," suggested Art, "same as you did the other cheque." Bertie nodded and added his signature. "Wait a second," said Art. He went out and came back within a minute. "They've taken it." He slapped the gratified young man on the shoulder. "You gotta come in on this now. It's 50-50. Come along, and I'll show you something else that I never intended showing a soul." He went out into the passage, opened a little door that led down a flight of stone steps to the cellar, switching on the light as he went down the stairs. Unlocking a heavy door, he threw it open. "See here, did you ever see anything like this?" Bertie Claude peered into the dark interior. "I don't see—" he began, when he was so violently pushed into the darkness that he stumbled. In another second the door closed on him, and he heard the snap of the lock. "I say, what's this?" "I say, you'll find out in a day or two," came the mocking voice of Mr. Lomer. Art closed the second door, ran lightly up the stairs, and joined the butler, the valet, the maid, and the 3 visitors in the drawing-room. "He's inside, and he stays there till the cheque matures. There's enough food and water in the cellar to last him a week. Now, you boys and girls, skip, and skip quick. I got a letter from this guy to his bank manager telling him to—" He consulted the letter, "to cash the attached cheque for my friend, Mr. Arthur Lomer." There was a murmur of approval from the troop. "Right, on your way. We meet at Leone's on the 14th of next month, and cut the stuff always." 2 days later, Mr. Art Lomer walked into the offices of the Northern Commercial Bank and sought an interview with the manager. That gentleman read the letter, examined the cheque, and touched a bell. To the clerk who came at his summons, he said, "Mr. Lomer would like as much of this as possible in American currency." They chatted on commercial topics until the clerk returned and laid a heap of banknotes on the table. Mr. Lomer produced a wallet, enclosed the money securely, shook hands with the manager, and walked out into the general office. And then he stopped, for Mr. J.G. Reader stood squarely in his path. "Payday for the troop, Mr. Lomer?" "Why, Mr. Reader, glad to see you, but I'm rather busy just now." "What do you think has happened to our dear friend, Mr. Bertie Claude Stafford?" asked Reader. "Oh, he's in Paris." "So soon," murmured Mr. Reader. "And the police only took him out of your suburban cellar an hour ago. Isn't modern transport wonderful? Marlow 1 minute, Paris the next." Art hesitated no longer. Thrusting Mr. Reader aside, he flew for the door. He was so annoyed that the 2 men who were waiting for him had the greatest difficulty in putting the handcuffs on his wrists. "Yes, sir," said Mr. Reader to his chief. "Art always travels with his troop. Of course I've had the house under observation ever since Mr. Stafford disappeared." He looked apologetic. "It wasn't my business, of course, and really I shouldn't have interfered. Only, as I've often explained to you, my mind works in such a curious way, just like a criminal's." The learned professions. Yet his word was law on a dozen racetracks, in a score of gaming clubs, and in innumerable establishments less liable to police supervision. People opposing him were dealt with, rival leaders paid tribute. He was immune from police interference by reason of their 2 failures to convict him. In short, Mo Liskey held an assured position in his world, and he might have gone on until the end of the chapter, only he fell for an outside proposition and handicapped himself with a private feud. It happened like this. There was a Moorish grafter named El Rabout, who had visited England several times on the banana boats which make the round voyage to London via various interesting ports. Rabout was useful to Mo Liskey because quite a lot of drugs are shipped via Trieste, and many a crate of oranges has been landed in the Pool of London that had, squeezed in their golden interiors, little metal cylinders containing smuggled heroin, cocaine, and other noxious substances. Rabout brought such things from time to time, was paid fairly, and was satisfied. One foggy October night in the saloon bar of the Four Jolly Seamen, he told Mo of a great steal carried out by a group of Angera thieves working in Fez. The loot was no less than the emeralds of Suleiman, the most treasured possession of Morocco. Not even Abdul Aziz in his most impecunious days had dared to remove them from the Mosque of Omar. The Angera men, being what they were, broke into the holy house, killed 2 guardians of the treasure, and had got away with the 9 green stones of the great king. Thereafter arose an outcry which was heard from the bazaars of Calcutta to the mean streets of Mazikazi. But the men of Angera were superior to the voice of public opinion, and they did no more than seek a buyer. "There is much profit in this for you and me, Mr. Goodman," said Rabout. All Europeans who paid on the nail were Mr. Goodman to El Rabout. "There is also death for me if this thing becomes known." Mo listened, smoothing his chin with a hand that sparkled and flashed. It was a little outside his line, but the newspapers had stated the bald value of the stolen property, and his blood was on fire at the prospect of earning $500,000 so easily. That Scotland Yard and every police headquarters in the world were on the lookout for the 9 stones of Suleiman didn't greatly disturb him. If the worst came to the worst, there was a reward of £5,000 for the recovery of the jewels. "I think it over. Where's the stuff?" "Here," said Rabout. "In 10-20 minutes I could lay them on your hands, Mr. Goodman." When a woman's bad, she's usually very bad indeed, and Mary Lou Plessy was an extremely malignant woman. She was rather tall and good-looking, with sleek black hair and a heavy black fringe that covered a forehead of some distinction. Mr. Reader saw her once. He was at the Central Criminal Court giving evidence against Bartholomew Xavier Plessy, an ingenious Frenchman who discovered a new way of making old money. His forgeries were well-nigh undetectable, but Mr. Reader was no ordinary man. He not only detected them, but he traced the printer. And that was why Bartholomew Xavier faced an unimpassioned judge who told him how very wrong it was to debase the currency. This, the debonair man in the dock, didn't resent. It was the judge's curt postscript which made him wince. "You will go to prison for 20 years. Whether Mary Lou loved her husband is open to question. The probabilities are that she didn't. But she hated Mr. Reader, not because he'd brought her man to his undoing, but because in the course of his evidence he'd used the phrase, "the woman with whom the prisoner is associated." There was something else. Had he so wished, Mr. J.G. Reader could have put her beside Plessy in the dock. She knew this, too, and loathed him for his mercy. Mrs. Plessy had a large flat in Portland Street in a block jointly owned by herself and her husband, for their graft had been on the grand scale, and here Mary Lou entertained lavishly. A few months after her husband went to prison, she dined with Mo Liskey. Mo might be uncrowned emperor of the underworld, but he had this redeeming feature. Mary Lou Plessy was his ideal woman, and it is creditable in a thief to possess ideals, however unworthily they may be disposed. He listened intently to Mary Lou's views, but, though he loved her, native caution prevailed. "I dare say I could get Reader, Mary Lou, but what's going to happen then?" "There'll be a squeak, louder than a bus brake. And he's dangerous. He's in the public prosecutor's office, and he wasn't put there because he's silly. Anyway, just now I've got one of the biggest deals on that I've ever touched. Can't you do him yourself? You're a clever woman." She looked at him contemptuously. "Of course, if you're scared of Reader—" "Scared? Don't be silly. If I wanted, that old bird would lose his feathers and be skinned for the pot before you could say Molisky. But why don't you tackle him yourself first? If you can't get him, let me know." In the public prosecutor's office they had no doubt about Mr. Reader's ability to take care of himself, and when Chief Inspector Pine came over from the yard to report that Mary Lou had been in conference with the most dangerous man in London, the assistant prosecutor grinned. "Reader needs no protection. I'll tell him if you like, but he probably knows all about it. No, that man's a genial mamba. Ever seen a mamba? A nice black snake. And you're dead 2 seconds after he strikes." Later that morning a messenger brought Mr. Reader to the chief's office. He arrived with that ineffable air of diffidence which gave the uninitiated such an altogether wrong idea of his calibre. He listened with closed eyes whilst his superior told him of the meeting between Liskey and Mary Lou. "Yes, sir, I had heard. Doesn't the continued freedom of Mr. Liskey cast a reflection upon our department, sir?" His chief looked up. It was inspiration which made him say, "Get him." Mr. Reader nodded very slowly. The greater part of a month passed before Mr. Reader showed any apparent interest in the case. He spent odd hours wandering in the neighbourhood of Lambeth, and on one occasion he was seen in the members' enclosure at Hurst Park racetrack, but he spoke to nobody, and nobody spoke to him. Then one night Mr. Reader came dreamily back to his well-ordered house in Brockley Road, and found, waiting on his table, a small, flat box, which, his housekeeper told him, had arrived by post that afternoon. He stripped the brown paper and then the silver tissue, and exposed a satiny lid, which he lifted daintily. There, under a layer of paper shavings, were roll upon roll of luscious confectionery. Chocolate, with or without dainty extras, had an appeal for Mr. Reader, and he took up a small globule garnished with crystallized violets and examined it admiringly. His housekeeper came in at that moment with his tea-tray and set it down on the table. Mr. Reader looked over his large glasses. "Do you like chocolates, Mrs. Carroll?" The elderly lady beamed. "Why, yes, sir." "So do I," said Mr. Reader. And shaking his head regretfully, he replaced the chocolate carefully in the box. "Unfortunately, my doctor, an excellent man, has forbidden me all sorts of confectionery until they've been submitted to the rigorous test of the public analyst." When Mrs. Carroll had gone, he replaced the layer of shavings with punctilious care, closed down the lid, and scribbled a note to a gentleman in Scotland Yard. Next, he carefully rewrapped the parcel and addressed it. Then he addressed himself, to his muffins and his large teacup. It was 6:15 in the evening when he had unwrapped the chocolates. It was exactly 11:15, as he turned out the lights, that he said aloud, "Mary Lou Plessy. Of course. Dear me." This was Wednesday evening. On Friday morning, Mary Lou Plessy had 2 early visitors, men who talked about fingerprints found on chocolates and other such matters. Half an hour later she sat in the cells listening to an inspector's recital of her offence. At the following sessions she went down for 2 years on a charge of conveying by post to John Reader a poisonous substance, to wit, aconite, with intent to murder. To the last, Mo Liskey sat in court, his drawn face testifying to the strength of his affection for the woman in the dock. After she disappeared from the dock, he went outside and made his first mistake. Mr. Reader was putting on his gloves when the dapper man strode up to him. "Name of Reader?" "That is my name, sir." "Mine is Mo Liskey. You've sent down a friend of mine." "Mrs. Plessy?" "You know, Reader, I'm going to get you for this." Somebody behind him caught his arm in a vice and swung him round. It was a city detective. "Take a walk with me." Mo went white. Remember that he owed the strength of his position to the fact that never once had he been convicted. "What's the charge?" "Intimidation of a Crown witness and using threatening language." Mo came up before the alderman at the Guildhall the next morning and was sent to prison for 3 weeks. Mr. Reader had scored a point. The gang leader was now, for the first time, a convicted person. "I think," said Mr. Reader to Pine when he was offered police protection, "I'd better have protection until Liskey comes out." Pine was bewildered. "You mean after he comes out?" "Until he comes out," insisted Mr. Reader. "After, well, I'd rather like to be unhampered by, police protection." Mo Liskey regained his liberty, bitterly conscious of his fallibility, and filled with the fear that the men he had ruled so completely might, in consequence, attempt to break away from their allegiance. There was something more than sentiment behind the fear. Mo drew close on 15,000 a year from his racecourse and clubhouse victims, while his crowd largely controlled the continental drug traffic, worth thousands a year. The first priority was Reader. He must fix him, and fix him so that there were no repercussions. To beat him up one night would be an easy matter, but that would look too much like carrying into execution the threat which had put him behind bars. Obviously some ingenuity was called for. The Big Six who controlled the interests serving Mo Liskey came together on the night of his release. The gathering was at a Soho restaurant where a private dining room was engaged. "He had 2 coppers with him all the time," said Teddy Alfield, his chief of staff. "Well, I'd have coshed him for you, Mo." "And I'd have coshed you, Teddy," said Mr. Liskey. "I left orders that he wasn't to be touched, didn't I?" "I want to manage this game myself. I've been doing some thinking whilst I was in bed. We don't want to beat him up, yet. What we want to do is to get him out of his job. They fired a man in the Home Office last week because he was found at the 95 Club after drinking hours. Now, our Mr. Reader's got a girl in Brockley, a young woman who's always going about with him. Bellman's her name, and she lives nearly opposite his house." He outlined a simple plan. Margaret Bellman left her office one evening, walked to the corner of Westminster Bridge and the Embankment, and looked around for Mr. Reader. Usually, if his business permitted, he was to be found hereabouts, though of late the meetings had been very few, and when she'd seen him he was usually in the company of 2 glum men who seated themselves on either side of him. She let one bus pass, and had decided to catch the second, which was coming slowly along the Embankment, when a parcel dropped at her feet. She looked round to see a well-dressed woman swaying with closed eyes, and had just time to catch her by the arm before she half collapsed. With her arm round the woman's waist, she assisted her to a nearby seat. "I'm so sorry," gasped the fainting lady. "Oh, thank you so much. I wonder if you'd call me a taxi." Beckoning a cab, Margaret assisted the woman to enter. "Would you like me to go home with you?" asked the girl.
"Oh, it would be good of you," murmured the lady, "but I fear to inconvenience you. It was so silly of me. My address is 105 Great Claridge Street." She recovered sufficiently on the journey to tell Margaret that she was Madame Le Maire, the widow of a French banker. The beautifully furnished house in the most expensive part of Mayfair suggested that Madame Le Maire was a woman of some wealth. A butler opened the door. A maid brought in the tea, which Madame insisted on the girl taking with her. "You are too good. I cannot be thankful enough to you, mademoiselle. We must meet again. Will you come one night to dinner? Shall we say Thursday?" Margaret Bellman hesitated. She was human enough to be impressed by the luxury of her surroundings, and this Madame La Mère had a charm which was difficult to resist. "Perhaps you have a friend you would like to invite?" Margaret smiled and shook her head. Curiously enough, the word "friend" suggested only the rather awkward figure of Mr. Reader, and somehow she couldn't imagine Mr. Reader in this setting. When she came out into the street and the butler had closed the door behind her, she had the first shock of the day. The object of her thoughts was standing on the opposite side of the road, a furled umbrella hooked to his arm. "Why, Mr. Reader!" "You had 7 minutes to spare," he said, looking at his pocket-watch. "I gave you half an hour. You were exactly 23 minutes and a few odd seconds." "How did you know I was there?" she asked. "I followed you. I don't like Mrs. Annie Feltham. She calls herself Madame something or other. It's not a nice club." "Club?" said Margaret. Mr. Reader nodded. "They call it the Muffin Club. Curious name. Curious members. It is not nice." She asked no further questions, but allowed herself to be escorted to Brockley, wondering just why Madame had picked upon her as a likely recruit to the gaieties of Mayfair. And now occurred the succession of incidents which at first so puzzled Mr. Liskey. By accident, as it seemed, he met Mr. Reader face to face in Piccadilly. "Good morning," said Mr. Reader. "I was so sorry for that unfortunate contretemps, but believe me, I bear no malice. And whilst you probably don't share my sentiments, my only wish is to live on the friendliest of terms with you." Liskey looked at him sharply. The old man was getting scared, he thought. Mo gave him his most charming smile. "That's all right, Mr. Reader. I don't bear any malice either. After all, it was a silly thing to say, and you have your duty to do." Mr. Reader listened with evident relief. He shook his head sadly. "The world is full of sin and trouble. I was saying as much to Mr. Pine early this morning when they raided the Muffin Club." "Raided the Muffin Club?" said Mo. "What do you mean?" "I've heard nothing about that." "Oh, you wouldn't. That kind of institution would hardly appeal to you. Only we thought it was best to raid the place, though in doing so I fear I have incurred the displeasure of a young lady friend of mine who is invited to dinner there tomorrow night." Now Mo Liskey knew that his plan had miscarried. Yet he was puzzled by the man's attitude. Reader removed his glasses and glared owlishly at his companion. "To seal our understanding, perhaps you'd like to come down to Brockley, where I live. Say 9 o'clock tonight. There's so much to talk about. Of course it would add to the comfort of all concerned if you didn't arrive conspicuously, if you understand what I mean. I should not like the people in my office to know, for example." A slow smile dawned on Liskey's face. It was his faith that all men had their price, whether it was paid in cash or terror, and this invitation to a secret conference was a tribute to the power he wielded. At 9 o'clock he came to Brockley, half hoping that Mr. Reader would go a little farther along the road which leads to compromise. But strangely enough, the elderly detective talked of nothing but generalities. Mo waited.
Only as Mr. Reader was helping his visitor on with his coat did he say, "There is something I wanted to say to you, but I fear that I must postpone that until another meeting. I'll walk with you to the corner of Lewisham High Road. The place is full of bad characters." Liskey submitted to the company of his host and walked to the church at the end of the road. "Good-bye, Mr. Liskey," said Reader. "I'll never forget this pleasant meeting. You've been of the greatest help. You may be sure that neither I nor the department I have the honour to represent will ever forget you." Liskey went back to town, a frankly bewildered man. In the early hours of the following morning, the police arrested his chief lieutenant, Teddy Alfield, and charged him with a car robbery which had been committed 3 months before. This was the first of the inexplicable happenings. The second came a few evenings later, when Mr. Reader chanced upon Mo Liskey just as he was returning to his flat off Portland Place, and chatted to him for a few minutes. Later that night, a squad from Scotland Yard descended upon the house of Harry Merton, took Harry and his wife from their bed, and charged them with the unlawful possession of stolen jewellery, which had been traced to a safe deposit. A week later, Liskey, returning from a vital interview with El Rabut, heard plodding steps overtaking him, and turned to meet Mr. Reader again. "How providential meeting you," said Reader. He lowered his voice. "Is it possible for you and me to meet together and exchange confidences?" Mo Liskey smiled slowly. "Coming to it at last, eh? All right, I'll meet you anywhere you please. Shall we say in the Mall, near the artillery statue, tomorrow night at 10? I don't think we'll be seen there." Liskey nodded and went on, wondering what the man had to tell him. At 4 that morning he was wakened by the telephone ringing furiously, and learnt to his horror that O'Hara, the most trustworthy of his gang leaders, had been arrested and charged with a year-old burglary. It was Carter, one of the minor leaders. When he'd imparted the news, he added, "What's the idea, Liskey?" "What do you mean, what's the idea?" "Come round and see me. I don't want to talk over the phone." Carter arrived a half an hour later, a scowling, suspicious man. "Now, what do you want to say?" asked Mo. "Just this," growled Carter. "A week ago you're seen talking to old Reader in Lewisham High Road, and the same night Teddy Alfield is pinched. You're spotted having another quiet talk with this old dog, and the same night another of the gang goes west. Last night I saw you with my own eyes having a confidential chat with Reader, and now Harry's gone." Mo looked at him incredulously. "What about it?" "Nothing, except it's an odd coincidence. The boys have been talking. They don't like it, and you can't blame them." Liskey sat pinching his lip, a faraway look in his eyes. So that was the old devil's game. He was undermining his authority, arousing a wave of suspicion which, if not checked, would sweep him from his position. "All right, Carter," he said. "Now I'll tell you, and you can tell the other boys just what's happened." In a few words he explained Mr. Reader's invitations. "And you can tell him from me that I'm meeting the old fellow tomorrow night, and I'm going to give him something to remember me by." After the man's departure, he sat going over the events of the past week. The 3 men who had been arrested had been under police suspicion for a long time, and Mo knew that not even he could have saved them. The arrests had been made by arrangement with Scotland Yard to suit the convenience of the artful Mr. Reader. "I'll artful him," said Mo, and spent the rest of the day making his preparations. At 10 o'clock that night, Mo Liskey passed under the Admiralty Arch. A yellow mist covered the park, a drizzle of rain was falling, and save for the cars that came at odd intervals towards the palace, there was no sign of life. He walked steadily past the memorial, waiting for Mr. Reader. 10 o'clock struck, then 1/4 past, but there was no sign of the detective. "He smelt a rat," said Molisky between his teeth, and returned to his pocket the short life-preserver he'd been carrying. It was at 11 o'clock that a patrolling police constable fell over a groaning something that lay across the pavement and, flashing his torch on the still figure, saw the carved handle of a Moorish knife before he recognized the pain-distorted face of the stricken Molisky.
"I don't quite understand how it all came about," said Pine thoughtfully. He'd been called into consultation from headquarters. "Why are you so sure it was this Moorish fellow, Rabut?"
Mr. Reader hastened to correct the mistaken impression. "I'm not sure. I mentioned Rabut because I'd seen him during the afternoon and searched his lodging for the emeralds, which, by the way, sir," he said, turning to his chief, "I'm perfectly sure are still in Morocco. Mr. Rabut was quite a reasonable man, bearing in mind that he's a stranger to our methods."
"Did you mention Molisky at all, Mr. Reader?" asked the assistant public prosecutor.
Mr. Reader scratched his chin. "I think I did. Yes, I'm pretty certain I told him that I had an appointment with Mr. Lisky at 10 o'clock that night. I may even have said where the appointment was to be kept. I can't remember exactly how the subject of Lisky came up. Possibly I may have tried to bluff this foreign visitor to our shores. Bluff is a vulgar word, but it'll convey what I mean, into the belief that, unless he told me about the emeralds, I should be compelled to consult someone who knew a great many secrets about him. Possibly I did say that. Mr. Lisky will be a long time in hospital, I hear. That is a pity. I should never forgive myself if my incautious words resulted in poor Mr. Lisky being taken to hospital alive."
When Mr. J.G. Reader had gone, the chief looked at Inspector Pine.
Pine smiled.
"What was the name of that dangerous reptile, sir?" "Mambo, isn't it? I must remember that."
Inventor of Nottingham, who earned more than a competence by methods which were displeasing to Scotland Yard. Not machines nor ingenious contrivances for saving labour did this young man invent, but stories. And they weren't stories in the accepted sense of the word, for they were misstatements designed to extract money from the pockets of simple-minded men and women. Mr. Elter employed no fewer than 25 aliases and as many addresses in the dissemination of his fiction, and he was on the way to amassing a considerable fortune when a square-toed nemesis took him by the arm and led him to the seat of justice. An unsympathetic judge sent Mr. Elter to prison for 7 years, describing him as an unconscionable swindler and a menace to society, at which Willie Elter smiled, for he had a skin beside which the elephant's was gossamer silk. Mr. Reader remembered the case chiefly because the prosecuting attorney, commenting upon the various disguises and subterfuges which the prisoner had adopted, remarked upon a peculiarity which was revealed in every part which the convict had played: his inability to spell the word able, which he invariably wrote as though he were naming the victim of Cain's envy. Few people knew that Mr. Reader had ever been associated with Scotland Yard. He himself evaded any question that was put to him on the subject. It was his amiable trait to pretend that he was the veriest amateur, and that his success in the detection of wrongdoing was to be traced to his own evil mind, that saw wrong very often where no wrong was. It was just as well that those who knew and pitied him for his apparent inadequacy and unattractive appearance didn't know what dark thoughts filled his mind. There was, for example, the very pretty girl who lived in Brockley Road. He liked Miss Margaret Bellman not because she was pretty, but because she was sensible. He liked her so well that he often travelled home on the bus with her, and they'd discuss the inadequacies of the government, the high cost of living, and other tender subjects with great animation. It was from Miss Bellman that he learnt about her fellow boarder, Mrs. Carlin. He once travelled back to Brockley with Mrs. Carlin, a frail, slim girl with experience in her face and the hint of tragedy in her eyes. And so, because Mr. Reader had the gift of evoking confidences, he happened to know all about Mr. Harry Carlin long before Lord Sellington sent for him. Mrs. Carlin, abandoned by her husband, spoke of him without bitterness, but also without regret. She hinted that there was a rich relation to whose wealth her husband would be heir, and that her son would in due course be the possessor of a great title, but be penniless. Mr. Reader, suspicious of peerages that come to Brockley, was nevertheless convinced that in all she said she was sincere. Sin had gone out of the world. Mr. Reader sat for a week on end in his little room, twiddling his thumbs. Then one morning the public prosecutor sent for his chief detective, and Mr. Reader obeyed the summons with a pleasant sense of anticipation. "Go over to the Foreign Office," said the prosecutor, "and have a talk with Lord Sellington. He's rather worried about a nephew of his, Harry Carlin, a pretty bad lot, and, unfortunately, Sellington's heir." "Dear me," said Mr. Reader, and stole forth. Lord Sellington, Under Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, was a bachelor and immensely rich. He'd been rich 20 years earlier when, in a panic due to certain legislation which he thought would affect him adversely, he sold his estates and invested the larger bulk of his fortune, against all expert advice, in American industrial stocks. Their value had trebled. Then heavy investments in oil had made him many times a millionaire. But he was a philanthropist and gave liberally to institutions devoted to the care of young children. He was the founder of the Eastleigh Children's Home and subscribed generously to other similar institutions. A thin, rather sour-faced man, he glared up under his shaggy eyebrows as Mr. Reader sidled apologetically into his room. "So, you're Reader, eh?" he said, evidently not much impressed by his visitor. Sit down, sit down." He flopped into his chair on the other side of the table. "I've sent for you in preference to notifying the police. Sir James speaks of you, Mr. Reader, as a gentleman of discretion." Mr. Reader bowed slightly, and there followed a long and awkward pause, which the Under-Secretary ended in an abrupt, irritable way. "I have a nephew, Harry Carlin. Do you know him?" "I know of him," said Mr. Reader, thinking of the deserted wife. "Then you know nothing good of him," said his lordship. "Man's a blackguard, a waster, a disgrace to the name he bears. If he weren't my brother's son, I'd have him under lock and key tonight. A scoundrel. I have 4 bills in my possession." He stopped himself, pulled open a drawer savagely, took out a letter, and slammed it on the table. "Read that." Mr. Reader pulled his glasses a little farther up his nose. It was headed "The Eastleigh Home for Children," and was a brief request for £5,000, which the writer said he would send for that evening. It was signed Arthur Lassard. "You know Lassard, of course?" said his lordship. "He's the gentleman associated with me in my philanthropic work. Certain monies were due for land which we purchased adjoining the home. As you probably know, there are lawyers who never accept cheques for properties they sell on behalf of their clients. I had the cash ready, and I left it with my secretary for one of Lassard's people to call for." His lordship looked at Reader. "That it was called for, I need hardly tell you. Whoever planned the coup planned it well. They knew I'd be speaking in the House of Lords last night. They also knew that I'd recently changed my secretary and had engaged a gentleman to whom most of my associates are strangers. A bearded man came for the money at 6:30, produced a note from Mr. Lassard, and that was the end of the money. Except that we've discovered it was changed this morning into American bills. Of course, both letters were forged.
Lassard never signed either, and he made no demand whatever for the money. It wasn't needed for another week."
"Did anybody know about this transaction?" asked Mr. Reader.
His lordship nodded. "My nephew. He came to my house 2 days ago to borrow money. He has a small income from his late mother's estate, but insufficient to support him in his reckless extravagance. He admitted frankly to me that he'd come back from Monte Carlo broke. He was in my library when my secretary came in with the money I'd drawn from the bank in preparation for paying the bill when it became due. Very foolishly I explained why I had so much cash in the house, and why I was unable to oblige him with the £1,000 which he wanted to borrow."
Mr. Reader scratched his chin. "What am I to do?"
"I want you to find Carlin. But most of all, I want that money back. Do you understand, Reader? You're to tell him that unless he repays—"
Mr. Reader was gazing steadily at the cornice moulding. "It almost sounds, my lord, as if I'm being asked to compound a felony. But I realise that in the peculiar circumstances we must adopt peculiar methods. Will you be good enough to tell me your nephew's address?"
Lord Sellington took a card from his pocket and threw it across the table.
"Jermyn Mansions," said Mr. Reader as he rose. "I'll see what can be done."
Lord Sellington grunted something which might have been a tender farewell, but probably was not. Jermyn Mansions is a small, narrow-fronted building, and, as Mr. Reader knew, and he knew a great deal, was a block of residential flats which were run by an ex-butler who was also the lessee of the establishment. By great good fortune, Harry Carlin was at home, and in a few minutes the man from the public prosecutor's office was ushered into a shabby drawing-room that overlooked Jermyn Street. A tall young man stood by the window, looking disconsolately into that narrow and lively thoroughfare. He turned as Mr. Reader was announced. Thin-faced, narrow-headed, small-eyed, he possessed the family failing of ready irritation. Mr. Reader saw, through an open door, a very untidy bedroom, and caught a glimpse of a battered trunk covered with continental labels. "Well, what the devil do you want?" demanded Mr. Carlin.
"May I sit down?" said the detective, and without waiting for an invitation pulled a chair from the wall. His self-possession, the hint of authority he carried, increased Mr. Harry Carlin's uneasiness. "This is a difficult subject to open," said Mr. Reader, carefully smoothing his knees, "and when I find myself in this predicament I usually employ the plainest language." And plain language he employed with a vengeance. Halfway through, Carlin sat down with a gasp. "What? Does that old brute dare— I thought you came about the bills. I mean, said Mr. Reader, that if you've had a little fun with your relative, I think that jest has gone far enough. Lord Sellington is prepared, when the money is refunded, to regard the whole thing as an over-elaborate practical joke on your part. But I haven't touched his beastly money. I don't want his money." Reader remained gently reasonable. "On the contrary, sir, you want it very badly. You left the Hotel Continental without paying your bill. You owe some £600 to various gentlemen. There is a warrant out for you in France for passing cheques which are usually described by the vulgar as, dud." Mr. Reader scratched his chin and looked thoughtfully out of the window. "Indeed, I know no gentleman in Jermyn Street who is so badly in need of money as your good self." Carlin would have stopped him, but he went on remorselessly. "I've been in the record department of Scotland Yard, where your name is not unknown, Mr. Carlin. You left London rather hurriedly to avoid proceedings of an unpleasant character. You are also associated with a racecourse fraud, and amongst your minor delinquencies there's a deserted young wife at present engaged as a typist in a city office, and a small boy for whom you have never provided." Carlin licked his dry lips and attempted a sneer, though his trembling hands betrayed his agitation. "Is that all?" Reader nodded. "Well, I'll tell you something. I want to do the right thing by my wife. I admit I haven't played square with her, but I've never had the money to play square. That old devil has always been rolling in it, curse him. I'm the only relation he has, and what has he done? Left everything to these damned children's homes of his. If somebody has caught him for 5,000, I'm glad. I shouldn't have the nerve to do it myself, but I'm glad if they did, whoever they may be." Mr. Reader let him rave on without interruption until at last, almost exhausted by his effort, he dropped down into a deep chair and glared at his visitor. "Tell him that." Mr. Reader made time to call at the little office in Portugal Street which housed the headquarters of Lord Sellington's various philanthropic enterprises. Mr. Arthur Lassard had evidently been in communication with his noble patron, for no sooner did Reader give his name than he was ushered into the plainly furnished room where the superintendent sat. It wasn't unnatural that Lord Sellington should have, as his assistant in his good work, as famous an organiser as Mr. Arthur Lassard. Mr. Lassard's activities in the philanthropic world were many. A broad-shouldered man with a jolly red face and a bald head, he had survived all the attacks which come the way of men engaged in charitable work, and was not particularly impressed by a recent visit he'd had from Harry Carlin. "I don't wish to be unkind," he said, "but our friend called here on such a lame excuse that I can't help feeling that his real object was to secure a sheet of my stationery. I did, in fact, leave him in the room for a few minutes." "What was his excuse?" asked Mr. Reader. Mr. Lassard shrugged. "He wanted money. At first he was civil and asked me to persuade his uncle. Then he grew abusive and said that I was conspiring to rob him. I and my infernal charities." He chuckled, but grew grave again. "I don't understand the situation," he said. "Evidently Carlin has committed some crime against his lordship, for he's terrified of him." "You think Mr. Carlin forged your name and secured the money?" The superintendent spread out his arms. "Who else can I suspect?" Mr. Reader took the forged letter from his pocket and read it again. "I've just been on the phone to his lordship," said Mr. Lassard. "He is waiting, of course, to hear your report. If you failed to make this young man confess his guilt, Lord Sellington intends seeing his nephew tonight and appealing to him. I can hardly believe that Mr. Carlin could have done this, though the circumstances seem very suspicious. Have you seen him, Mr. Reader?" "I have," said Mr. Reader. "Oh, yes, I've seen him." Mr. Arthur Lassard was scrutinizing his face as though he were trying to read the conclusion which the detective had reached, but Mr. Reader's face was notoriously expressionless. He offered a limp hand and went back to the Under-Secretary's house. The interview was short and, on the whole, disagreeable. "I never dreamt he would confess to you," said Lord Sellington with ill-disguised contempt. "Harry needs somebody to frighten him, and my God, I'm the man to do it. I'm seeing him tonight." A fit of coughing stopped him, and he gulped savagely from a little medicine bottle that stood on his desk. "I'll see him tonight, and I'll tell him what I intend doing. I've spared him so far because of our relationship and because he inherits the title. But I'm finished. Every penny I have goes to charity. I'm good for 20 years yet, but every penny—" He stopped. He was a man who never disguised his emotions, and Mr. Reader, who understood men, saw the struggle going on in Sellington's mind. "He says he hasn't had a chance. I may have treated him unfairly. We shall see." He waved the detective from his office as though he were dismissing a strange dog that had intruded upon his privacy, and Mr. Reader went out reluctantly, for he had something to tell his lordship. It was peculiar to Mr. Reader that in his more secretive moments he sought the privacy of his old-fashioned study in Brockley Road. For 2 hours he sat at his desk calling a succession of numbers, and curiously enough, the gentlemen to whom he spoke were bookmakers. In the days when he was the greatest expert in the world on forged currency notes, he had been brought into contact with many bookies, often the innocent medium by which the forger distributes his handicraft, and often the instrument of his detection. It was a Friday, a day on which most of the principals were in their offices till a late hour. At 8 o'clock, Mr. Reader finished, wrote a note, and, phoning for a messenger, sent his letter on its fateful errand. He spent the rest of the evening musing on past experiences and in refreshing his memory from the thin scrapbooks which filled 2 shelves in his study. What happened elsewhere that evening can best be told in the plain language of the witness box. Lord Sellington had gone home after his interview with Mr. Reader, suffering from a feverish cold, and he was disposed, according to the evidence of his secretary, to put off the interview which he had arranged with his nephew. But Mr. Carlin was not at his flat, and could not be contacted. Until 9 o'clock his lordship was busy with the affairs of his numerous charities, Mr. Lassard being in attendance. Lord Sellington was working in a small study which opened from his bedroom. At 9:15, Carlin arrived and was shown upstairs by the butler, who subsequently stated that he heard voices raised in anger. Mr. Carlin came downstairs and was shown out as the clock struck 9:30. A few minutes later, the bell rang for Lord Sellington's valet, who went up to assist his master to bed. At 7:30 the next morning, the valet, who slept in an adjoining apartment, went into his master's room to take him a cup of tea. He found his employer lying face downwards on the floor. He was dead, and had been for some hours. There was no sign of wounds, and at first glance it looked as though this man of 60 had collapsed in the night. But there were some unusual circumstances. In Lord Sellington's bedroom was a small steel wall safe, and the first thing the valet noticed was that this was open. Papers were lying on the floor, and in the grate was a heap of paper which, except for one corner, was entirely burnt. The valet telephoned immediately for the doctor and for the police, and from that moment the case went out of Mr. Reader's able hands. Later that morning he reported briefly to his superior the result of his inquiries. "Murder, I'm afraid," he said. "The Home Office pathologist is perfectly certain that it is a case of aconitine poisoning. The paper in the hearth has been photographed, and there's no doubt whatever that the burnt document is the will in which Lord Sellington left all his property to various charitable institutions." He paused. "Well?" asked his chief. "What does that mean?" Mr. Reader coughed. "It means that if this will cannot be proved, and I doubt whether it can, his lordship died intestate. The property goes with the title." "To Carlin?" asked the startled prosecutor. Mr. Reader nodded. "Incidentally, there were other things burnt. 4 small oblong slips of paper, which had evidently been fastened together by a pin. These are quite indecipherable." The public prosecutor looked up. "You haven't mentioned the letter that arrived by district messenger after Lord Sellington had retired for the night." Mr. Reader rubbed his chin. "No, I didn't mention that." "Well, has it been found?" Mr. Reader hesitated. "I don't know. I rather think that it hasn't." "Would it throw any light upon the crime, do you think?" asked the prosecutor. Mr. Reader scratched his chin with some sign of embarrassment. "I should think it might. Will you excuse me, sir? Inspector Salter is waiting for me." And he was out of the room before the prosecutor could frame any further inquiry. Inspector Salter was striding impatiently up and down the little room when Mr. Reader came back. They left the building together. The car that was waiting for them brought them to Jermyn Street in a few minutes. Outside the flat, 3 plainclothesmen were waiting. The inspector passed into the building, followed closely by Mr. Reader. They were halfway up the stairs when Reader said, Does Carlin know you?"
"He ought to," was the grim reply. "I did my best to send him to prison before he skipped from England."
Said Mr. Reader. "I'm sorry he knows you." The inspector stopped on the stairs.
"Why?"
"Because he saw us getting out of the cab. I caught sight of his face, and—" He stopped suddenly. The sound of a shot thundered through the house, and in another second the inspector was racing up the stairs 2 at a time and had burst into the suite which Carlin occupied. A glimpse of the prostrate figure told them they were too late. The inspector bent over the dead man.
"This has saved the country the cost of a murder trial."
"I think not," said Mr. Reader gently, and explained his reasons. Half an hour later, as Mr. Lassard walked out of his office, a detective tapped him on the shoulder.
"Your name is Elter," he said, "and I want you for murder."
"It was a very simple case, really, sir," explained Mr. Reader to his chief. "Elter, of course, was known to me personally, but I remember especially that he couldn't spell the word able. I recognized this peculiarity in our friend the moment I saw the letter which he wrote to his patron asking for the money. It was Elter himself who drew the £5,000. Of that I'm convinced. The man is, and always has been, an inveterate gambler, and I didn't have to make many inquiries before I discovered that he was owing a large sum of money, and that one bookmaker had threatened to bring him before Tattersall's committee unless he paid. That would have meant the end of Mr. Lassard, the philanthropic custodian of children. Which, by the way, was always Elter's role. He ran bogus charitable societies. It's extraordinarily easy to find dupes who are willing to subscribe for philanthropic purposes. Many years ago, when I was a young man, I was instrumental in getting him 7 years. I'd lost sight of him since then until I saw the letter he sent to Lord Sellington. Unfortunately for him, one line ran, "I shall be glad if you are able, spelt ABEL, to let my messenger have the money." I called on him and made sure, and then I wrote to his lordship, who apparently didn't open the letter till late that night. Elter had called on him earlier in the evening and had a long talk with him. I only surmise that Lord Sellington had expressed a doubt as to whether he ought to leave his nephew penniless, scoundrel though he was, and Elter was terrified that his plans for getting possession of the old man's money were in danger of failing. Moreover, my appearance in the case had scared him. So he decided to kill Lord Sellington that night. He took aconitine with him to the house and introduced it into the medicine bottle which always stood on Sellington's desk. Whether the old man destroyed the will which disinherited his nephew before he discovered he'd been poisoned, or whether he did it after, we shall never know. When I'd satisfied myself that Lassard was Elter, I sent a letter by special messenger to Stratford Place.
"That was the letter delivered by special messenger?" asked the prosecutor.
Mr. Reader nodded. It's possible that Sellington was already under the influence of the drug when he burnt the will, and he burnt also the 4 bills which Carlin had forged, and which the old man had held over his head as a threat. Carlin may have known his uncle was dead. He certainly recognized the inspector when he stepped out of the cab. Thinking he was to be arrested for forgery, he shot himself. Mr. Reader's melancholy face grew longer. "I wish I had never known Mrs. Carlin," he said. "My acquaintance with her introduces that element of coincidence which is permissible in stories, but is so distressing in actual life. It shakes one's confidence in the logic of things."